Today's debate on how best to have impact while still ensuring market rate financial returns is something students here have been pondering extensively. And before I introduce the panel, I'd like to get a sense of who's in the room at the moment, and I think this might shape the questions that we have here today. So if you could raise your hand if you are an MBA student currently. Right. Could you raise your hand if you're another master's student on campus? Do you want to shout out what other programs you're from? Perfect. Undergrads, do we have any undergrads in the room? We've got a lot of undergrads. Wonderful. And then for those of you out in the field, do we have any corporates in the room at the moment? Great. Thank you. And investors. Excellent. This is going to be a really, we're going to get some great questions from you guys. This is exciting. So what makes today's Peterson is particularly exciting is that all of the participants have a University of California affiliation. So our moderator, Wendy Walker, is a Haas MBA alum. She's the managing director and outsourced CIO at Cambridge Associates. Ann Simpson's the current investment director of sustainability at CalPERS, which manages retirement pensions for California state, school, and public agency members, which means she manages my pension, so thank you.
Doing my best.
Yeah, thank you. And that's the largest public pension fund in the United States. Jagdeep Singh Bachar is the CIO and VP of Investments at University of California Office of the President and manages over $110 billion on behalf of the Board of the Regents of the University of California. And then Adam Sterling is also a Haas MBA alum and a Bolt JD alum, and he was the co-founder of the Sudan Divestment Task Force while he was a student and is currently the executive director of the Berkeley Center for Law, Business, and the Economy. So lastly, just a couple of logistics. You may see some fantastic artists in the back of the room. So that is the company Roguemark, which was founded by Abby, who's also a UC Berkeley alum. And they'll be doing visual note-taking of this whole session. So we encourage you to come check out what they've done. And then over at the Center for Responsible Business, we have all of our visual notes from all of our sessions this year. You all have a cue card on your chair. And anytime you have a question, just please write it in our card and just politely raise your hand. And Katie over there will come and get it, and then she'll hand your questions to Wendy throughout the session. At the end of the event, please fill out an evaluation you'll receive. Your feedback is extremely important to us and helps us seed what conversations we want to have here at Haas. And you can be entered to win Patagonia swag and an Amazon gift card. So lastly, just note everything at today's event is compostable. As you know, this building is a zero-waste building, one of the first zero-waste buildings in the entire United States at a university campus. So we like to keep it that way. So compost bins are found throughout. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Saren, for that introduction and for the invitation to come back to Haas. It's exciting to be here in this new building, which was not around when I graduated. I think this topic is, as many of you, I'm sure, agree, is very timely. Just today, Norway's parliament formally ratified a decision to divest $9 to $10 billion of coal-related investments from their sovereign wealth fund. And they cited both climate risk and financial risk. And we're aware that UC Berkeley and many other campuses around the country have divestment movements focused on topics ranging from fossil fuels to private prisons to banks funding the Dakota Access Pipeline, among many other topics. And at the same time, some pioneers in the field of responsible investment movement, including the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, argue that active ownership and shareholder engagement are critical to advancing meaningful change to corporate behavior on these important topics. While newer groups, such as Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Coalition, are more focused on investments in proactive solutions to make the sorts of changes that they want to see. So I'm honored to be here with these three thought leaders in the field of sustainable and responsible investing. I'm delighted that Saren pointed out that they all have their Cal affiliation. Go Bears. I'm sure when you registered, you saw each of their full bios, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the more salient points for today's discussion. Ann Simpson, in her role as Investment Director of Sustainability at CalPERS, among her many responsibilities there, she oversees their shareholder engagement and efforts around climate change, diversity and inclusion and alignment of interests. In addition to her role on the advisory board here at Haas, she's also board member at many other similar organizations, and she's authored 2 books on responsible investing. Jagdeep Singh Bachar, soon after joining UC as the Chief Investment Officer, he oversaw the development and the adoption of a framework on sustainable investing for the $110 billion of assets across the university. And I think it's interesting that they developed this program to guide the process of evaluating ESG factors with the same weight as other material risk factors influencing investment decisions. And as part of that initiative, as many of you know, the university has significantly reduced holdings of fossil fuels and made major allocations to solutions-oriented investments, accelerating the energy transition. And then Adam, as we heard, he spends his days here down the road at the Berkeley Center for Law, Business, and the Economy, but he still remains active in efforts to combat genocide through his role as non-resident senior fellow of the Enough Project, which builds on his prior work as co-founder of the Sudan Divestment Task Force. So we've structured our conversation today in 3 segments. First, although each of these 3 panelists have in practice employed a mix of activist approaches to achieve positive impact through investment portfolios, we've asked each of them to present a distinct pro-argument for just one approach in isolation. Adam will advocate for divestment and for shareholder engagement, and Jagdeep for proactive, solutions-oriented investment strategies. Following those 3 opening position statements, we will then delve into a more nuanced discussion about divestment in practice, both on a standalone basis and in conjunction with engagement and proactive investments. And finally, in our 3rd prepared segment, and we'll be peppering in your audience questions throughout this, our panelists will share information about progress and wins that each of them and their organizations have achieved through their combination of approaches. With that, I will turn it over to Adam to start with the case for divestment.
Thank you. Well, good to be back here, and welcome to Berkeley for those of you that aren't students here. It's a pleasure. I'm going to do my best. I haven't held the stage in this manner for over a decade, so it was maybe 15 years ago when I was a young student finishing up my career at another UC, UCLA, that we started looking into the policy of divestment in response to the ongoing situation in the Darfur region of Sudan. And it evolved. We'll talk a bit more about the campaign, and I'll reference it in a minute. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I want to take 2 positions and make the case for divestment in 2 cases. The first argument that I'm going to give is that I believe that divestment can actually make engagement more effective, or at least the threat of divestment. So a carrot and sticks approach to engagement. And I think in many shareholder activism campaigns, as was the case with ours, engagement should ultimately be the focus. But again, I think there are cases where divestment can make that engagement more effective. Number 2, I question, and I think this may be more relevant to some of the other campaigns calling for divestment, potentially in fossil fuels, that there may be situations where engagement is either not appropriate or less appropriate for the ultimate goal of changing corporate behavior. So on my first point, as far as divestment making engagement more effective, I'll use the example of the Sudan Divestment Task Force, which was the organization I started over a decade ago when I was at UCLA, and we found that the University of California, through its retirement funds, had exposure to certain companies operating in Sudan. One of our faculty chairs at the time was quite active in the apartheid divestment campaign, so we looked at that for kind of guidance on how we would develop our campaign. It turned into a big kind of action across the UC campuses. We spent the year developing groups and meeting with students, faculty, organizations, unions across the state. Ultimately, after some initial resistance, the University of California decided to take this seriously, and they convened a committee, a working group, to look into recommending a policy for the University of California, and I was appointed to that committee. And we looked at what was happening in the divestment landscape in response to Sudan. So the state of Illinois had actually passed what we call the blanket divestment campaign, basically requiring the state to cut ties with any and all companies connected to Sudan. We looked a little bit closer and felt like there was a group of companies that had unique influence in the country with the government, and we wanted to ultimately influence their behavior. So we spent the next 6 months conducting research on companies operating in Sudan, and then developed a sense of what type of behavior we wanted to see them take on, both engaging the government politically, looking at their environmental, social impact in the country, this idea we called substantial action. This was soon codified in the legislation that we later developed. But the idea was we wanted these companies, relatively small group, about 3 dozen in Sudan, to take substantial action. And we wanted to engage with them to do so. So the policy that we developed, which was ultimately adopted by the UC, it was later put into legislation, adopted by the state of California, and then 26 other US states and the federal government in 2007, was this idea of targeted divestment. So the state would require the state's pension funds to basically engage with these companies, give them a period of time to respond and to adopt what we called this substantial action. And for companies that fail to adopt substantial action, divestment would occur. And after a while, when we had grown, we actually gained the capacity to engage with these companies directly, my organization, because we were also developing the research that we were providing to all of these institutional investors. And I truly believe that, very least, certainly these folks would go and talk to a CalPERS or a CalSTRS, but at least for an advocacy group like ours, I do think it was the threat of divestment and the fact that we are coordinating this global campaign that really brought them to the table. And we did see a number of companies take substantial action and I think continue to use their influence. Although we can talk about this later, the situation in Sudan continues to be fragile, to put it mildly. I do think we've made a difference in improving the corporate footprint in that country. So that's the first point. I think that's one example where the threat of divestment, and this was the case of the first time an ongoing conflict had been declared a genocide while it was still happening, the case of Sudan. My second point, I'll make this quickly, is I do believe there are situations where engagement may not be appropriate in this space, and I think potentially in the fossil fuel space where it's much more difficult to imagine a company's, when you're kind of addressing their core business, to imagine them taking substantial action. Certainly another good example might be an arms manufacturer, and there were certainly companies in our targeted divestment policy in Sudan carved out arms manufacturers. That was a candidate for immediate divestment in the case of a country that was dealing with war and genocide. So I question whether, again, I think when there's an opportunity to change corporate behavior, engagement is the best option. And I do think there are situations where divestment can make that more effective. But ultimately, I also question whether there are situations where a corporate change in behavior is just not feasible. And in that case, I question whether, especially a public fund, should be invested in those companies.
That's very helpful, Adam. Anne, I think that's a nice segue to your opening statement on the case for engagement.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody on this rainy day. I feel quite at home. I'm from a rainy place, and it's actually lovely to see the rain. I miss it, and California needs it here. So the first question I want to ask this group is to think about how many companies, products, services, and otherwise that you've come into contact with since you woke up this morning. So how many of you switched on the kettle, had some electricity flowing through, or put on the gas? Yeah? Anybody have a cup of tea this morning? Right. And did you grow your own tea, or did you buy your tea? Did you buy your coffee? It's America, probably coffee. Coffee? Tea. Come on, it's a tea-drinking nation.
I'm a tea. I'm a
coffee.
tea.
Coffee.
Okay, so, and then probably you mounted a bicycle or put on some shoes to walk here. You probably had some of this lovely food, this lemonade. You're in a place which is manufactured and built by, well, a wonderful invention, a great testament to human ingenuity, which is the corporation. So you can talk another day about the history of the company, but the company was invented for specific purposes, which was to allow the aggregation of capital. It was also to allow an entity to continue providing its coffee, tea, services, buildings, bicycles, petrol, all the things that we rely upon. But the other thing that the company has always needed is capital from its owners. And from the very beginning, when the company was being invented back in the 1840s, the joint stock company in the UK, the idea was there from the beginning that if you were going to persuade people to part with their money and invest that money in a company, they had to have rights. They had to be able to ensure that the purpose their money was intended to be invested in was what they expected, and also if the people running the company made a mess of it, that they could be kicked out. And also that you could call meetings, you could ensure there were audited accounts, and so on and so forth. So now, if we look around us, this is the ubiquitous form of economic activity. And it's the one upon which most human welfare relies. I mean, there are variations on this theme, like the B Corporation, cooperatives, state-owned enterprises, but the dominant world economy now relies on the corporation. So that then poses a question of, as the company has grown in all these markets, who owns companies now? Now, until about the 1960s, you could look down the share register of any big company, General Electric, IBM, Rolls-Royce, and you'd find what were listed were individuals, otherwise known as capitalists. Cigar, top hat, monocle, like the Monopoly board, you've seen it. But individuals own corporations. But then, in the post-war period, there was a very profound shift in the way that financial savings were organized. And it was the invention of pension funds, where Jagdeep and I both work. That's our day job, running pension fund money. But what's happened, slowly but surely, is that ordinary working people's money has been channeled into pension funds and insurance companies. And now, ordinary working people's savings are the main shareholders of companies. So if you think about CalPERS, we are the biggest, not the best, but we are the biggest pension fund in the United States. So today we're at around $343 billion that we're responsible for investing. And that is for close to 2 million public servants, including university. Seren, I think you reminded me, we're looking after your pension. But this includes the firefighters, the police, the university professors, the janitors, the judges, all those people at the DMV, you know, when you're queuing up and saying, why is it taking so long? CalPERS members, be nice, you know. When you're getting a parking ticket, a speeding ticket, or, you know, otherwise making an encounter with the law, it's probably a CalPERS member that you're dealing with. So two things come from this. One is that we have a fiduciary duty to these people. We don't invest, you know, it's like Anne having a little flutter on this investment or that investment, you know, Las Vegas style. We actually have a legal duty to make sure that we invest this money with certain things in mind, which go right back to trust law, which was invented around the time of the Crusades, going back even further. Number one, prudence. You have to make sure that you are being careful. You have a duty of care. You have a duty of loyalty. Loyalty means the only thing that you're thinking about when you invest is the interests of your beneficiaries. Now, because we're a pension fund, we have nearly 2 million members, these people are at different ages and stages of their life. We have people in retirement who need cash, and we've got people who are your age and younger who are just joining some form of public service in California. So if you model that all out and say, how long have we got to invest for? It's the best part of a century, even if you close the doors in the morning. So I'm telling you all of that for this reason. Let's step aside and say, okay, look at all the corporations in which we need to invest to generate those pension fund returns. I actually have in my bag, and I'll give some to you if anyone's interested, something we call the CalPERS Pension Buck. It looks like a dollar bill, but not with Mr. Mnuchin signing on the bottom. You saw that, didn't you? He's got dollar bills with his name on it now. That's a big honor for anyone. Our CalPERS pension buck shows that for every dollar we pay out, which is over $20 billion a year, we put out in cash to fund people's pensions, 65 cents comes from investments. And if we don't make that number, what happens is the taxpayers of California are on the hook. They will have to put more money into the pension scheme and pay. So that's what the fiduciary duty is all about. So the question then is, as we look at the world and all the problems around us, and we see climate change, we see inequality, We see racial discrimination, gender discrimination. We see poverty. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, how many of you are familiar with these? Yes? Excellent. That is the world's to-do list. These are the 17 things we all need to get done for the next 15 years. And that's all going to take money. So then when you think about things like divestment, what you're really saying to funds like CalPERS is, step back, don't put your money there. Say, okay, don't put your money there. Step away from climate change. Don't invest in fossil fuel companies. We have a different answer. We say, no, what we need to do is step up, not step back, and behave like owners. Because going right back to Victorian law, we are the owners of the corporation, and if CalPERS teams up with the other pension funds and the other insurance companies, we are the owners of the corporations which have an impact on our society and our economy. Now, we want the whole system to work because we have fiduciary duty to our pensioners. But what it also means is that we can link arms with other long-term owners and actually make a difference to who's on these boards, what information they disclose, and that just generally ensure accountability.
That's great. Thank you, Anne.
I was going to give one example.
Okay, sure.
Sorry, I'm going on too long. The example on climate change is as follows. You all have heard of Exxon. Some of you probably go and pump gas from Exxon stations. It's the biggest oil and gas company in the world. 2 years ago, we won the right with other investors to be able to put forward directors to the board of Exxon on the ballot for the company. And that was an example of how we can organize as owners. Shortly thereafter, Exxon put a climate scientist onto the board, Dr. Susan Avery. This year, we actually won a different proposal, which was on climate risk reporting, which is calling on Exxon to report on how it's going to make the transition from where they are today to the less than 2 degrees warming that's in the Paris Agreement. So it's one example, and we've got plenty of others, but I would say if you wash your hands of the corporation, you will not change a thing. If you organize, educate, agitate, and organize as the owners of corporations, you can make change. I rest my case, sir.
Great, thank you. And Jagdeep, you've been very patient.
Sorry, I didn't mean to steal Jagdeep.
No.
Jagdeep can have some of my time from the next bit.
That's right. No, it's great. We'd love to hear your case for proactive solutions.
So this is a debate, right? This is a debate.
Yeah,
so let me start by saying, Anne,
yes, sir.
There are good corporations and there are not so good corporations. In that context, I have to tell you that 3.5 years ago when I showed up at the University of California, now it's important to note I came from Alberta. Alberta, where you have what they call either the oil sands or the tar sands. And I helped run a sovereign wealth fund that managed money for monies coming in from these oil sands companies. And I showed up here. One of the most important tasks that I was put to was, what should we do about fossil fuels? Now, I have to tell you, looking back 3.5 years, I want to start by thanking all students in this room, our faculty, our staff, and everyone concerned about the bad actors that exist in the corporate world. Because frankly, climate change is real, and it's real today. And as a result, we engaged with all of you to learn about what to do with respect to fossil fuels. And here's the good news. In fact, I wish I would have listened to you the day I showed up. Because had I done that when oil was $100 and something, and oil is now 50 plus, gone to 30, we would have been better off from an investment standpoint. But life is not that easy. It isn't a binary decision. You can't make these decisions on a given day. And you can't be abrupt about it. Because I respect the fact that you and I both have fiduciary responsibility. I get that. But at the end of the day, that responsibility is one that's been entrusted to both of us by them. We have 265,000 students across our system. We have 233,000 pensioners at this university called the University of California. And our staff, 312,000 of you, voluntarily save $1 billion a year for your future. So if you tell us to do something about a future that you think is uncertain, We can't tell you that our fiduciary responsibility is to maximize your return, and we will not listen to you. Because that's what we expect you to do every day, is to listen to your professors and your faculty and your staff as you learn and you discover what the new world is going to look like. So from my perspective, and that off the University of California, I think that corporations are important. I believe in being a capitalist because that's the job I'm hired for. I fundamentally believe that we have a fiduciary responsibility, but that responsibility is to all of you and our stakeholders. But I think the world has changed. And in that changing world, you simply can't maximize return by minimizing risk. You have to focus on the cost of investing, and you have to focus on non-financial risks. That's why environmental issues matter. Social issues matter. Not every corporation has great governance practices. Bad governance actors matter. As investors, I get it. We have a choice. That choice is to engage or divest. I can go all day long to ExxonMobil and tell them what to do. I'm pretty sure ExxonMobil is going to tell me what to do very quickly. So we've done a couple of things. We've agreed to engage where it matters. But you know what? Thanks to the push from the students and this great institution, we have decided, on the basis of the fact that as long-term investors, these financial risks will have an implication for the returns and the investments we hold on your behalf, we made some decisions driven by our financial risks that we forecast over the long term. We sold our holdings in coal companies. We didn't put any press release out that only qualified a certain kind of coal company over another. We sold them all. I came from Alberta. I can tell you, no matter how great the corporations are or how wonderful engagement might be in Alberta, you will not make money in oil sands companies if the price of oil is below $80 a barrel, period. And if that's the case, it doesn't matter how much you engage with the Albertan oil sands companies. With the amount of pollution that goes into the atmosphere by these companies and the lack of economics by being invested in them, it was a crystal clear financial risk to sell our holdings in oil sands companies when no one else was talking about them. I'm glad everybody was focused on coal and we got out of oil sands at the same time. Private prisons. Look, Black lives matter. It's a fact of life. And in that context, when you think about the issue of private prisons and you look at what is going on in our judicial system and you think about the issues that this involves, and we looked at it. The students came to us. We took time to understand the risks. And at the end of the day, we owned $27 million in private prison companies out of a base of $115 billion. Do you think we could have engaged with private prison companies by owning those $27 million? Probably not. We made a choice to sell our holdings in private prisons because of the risks we saw in holding these companies over the long term. North Dakota Pipelines, we made the same judgment. We made the judgment to sell our holdings in North Dakota pipeline-related energy companies. Those are the things we've done. We've also developed a sustainability framework around thinking about these things from a financial lens. But most importantly, and I think even our students would agree, that divesting is a singular action. Investing is a long-term solution. Mm-hmm. And that is what we have embraced as an important part of our strategy going forward. I'm not going to say all of this right now. We can come back to it. But I will conclude with one thing today. I think today marks a historical day, not because we're all getting together on a rainy day in Berkeley, but when the largest fund on the planet that has over $1 trillion decides to sell its oil and gas holdings, it's not $9 billion. It's north of $55 billion over a little period of time. I'm not sure that you can really win any other arguments when it comes to this issue. If I joined today, I'm sure I'd be having a different conversation and rethinking this whole issue. So from my perspective, I'm not totally advocating that we fully divest out of fossil fuel companies today, but I will submit to you that with a 4-year-old and a 10-year-old, and the fact that we are all of a certain vintage here, this is going to matter to our lives, and we just simply can't ignore. And sometimes companies don't listen when you engage. You have to send them a strong message. So on that basis, I submit we do a number of things, but where we need to divest or sell our holdings because they are financial risks to the investments we hold, we absolutely do that. Thank you.
So Anne, building on this concept of selling out of certain types of companies, you made a very eloquent case for shareholder engagement, and while CalPERS is primarily active in that space, it has chosen to divest from, say, firearm and tobacco companies. So can you talk us through the process by which that investment decision was made?
Yeah, no, thank you. Of course, you realize that just for fun, we've been set up to disagree with each other. And that's entirely...
I'm being serious, though.
We'll take that outside. That's entirely for your entertainment. So although CalPERS' main strategy is engagement, ownership, I want to say that engagement on its own doesn't make much sense. There's two other things you have to put side by side with it. The first is advocacy. In other words, if the rules of the market are not fostering the behavior we want to see by companies, you can engage till the cows come home and nothing will happen. So a big piece of what we do, and I know this is very much Jagdeep's agenda as well, is being a strong voice in places like the Paris Agreement, with the SEC for regulations on diversity and inclusion, and a whole range of other important topics. So we need to be public advocates for the rules and regulations that make sure that companies are held accountable for the use of our capital, but also for their impact on the wider economy and for society. That's what the regulators are there to do. And the other thing that we have an important job with is integrating all of these issues on environmental, social, and governance into our own investment processes. So, and in that process, it means you find that you have opportunities. It's not just that we are beating on the door at Exxon talking about a transition strategy. It's also looking at the opportunities that the climate change transition is giving. So some of you know TPG is a big venture capital firm. They've just initiated a fund called RISE. That's all anchored onto the Sustainable Development Goals of saying, wow, okay, we've got a public policy framework. Now that is creating investment opportunity to deploy new capital into. And I can give you more examples of the positive side. I think Jagdeep put it very well, that companies do not exist in isolation from societies and the economies that they operate within. If they treat their employees badly, they're going to see how that impacts productivity, recruitment. I mean, you can actually almost forget for the moment whether it's right or wrong. The whole thing simply won't work. And we've incorporated this idea about human capital into our investment beliefs. By saying investment, we've redefined it. We've said, yes, investment is about deploying financial capital, risk and return, but it's also about managing human capital. That's the people who are employed, the communities, the supply chain, the human capital, and the physical capital. All three forms of capital are the source of value creation. And that's why we are viewing environmental, social, and governance issues as part of our investment duty. And we've developed a sustainable investment strategy for the total fund for that reason. Now, in this consideration, we bump into the tobacco industry. And some years ago, our board decided to sell shares in tobacco. So I'm coming back to your question. We revisited this question last year, really to take stock of the risk that was seen by the board some while back was the biggest litigation yet known to man or beast. It was over $200 billion in litigation. And no surprise, because society is turning up to collect from the companies for the healthcare costs that they're imposing on the taxpayer. I mean, really just think of it as sort of taxpayer justice. If companies pollute, companies make people ill, companies cause costs, the taxpayer is ultimately going to have to pick up the tab. So we had a very deep discussion and a review of the tobacco industry. And our board not only decided to renew the exclusion they had, they extended it. And this comes back to that 100-year time horizon that we've got. And if you look at the tobacco industry, where the product, when used as intended, kills the customer, and start to think about a 30 to 50-year projection, what we see is the structural decline in tobacco smoking. I mean, I think that there has been a lot of profitability over the short to medium term as the tobacco companies have been able to go into new markets, particularly emerging markets. But the point is that those we do not see as, to quote the phrase, sustainable, a sustainable business strategy of killing your customers, to be blunt. On firearms, the argument was somewhat different, and it goes as follows. We are based in California. CalPERS is governed by the California Constitution. We're here to serve the public servants of California. That's what we're here to do. Our motto is, we serve those who serve California, which is a very nice service. What is banned in California for sale to the public is assault weapons. And the weapons that were used in the Sandy Hook massacres cannot be bought by the public legally in this state. And it was viewed as a conflict between where we are and how we are constitutionally arranged, that we should be investing in something which is not even legal for sale. And that is a topic which the State Treasurer has raised again. And no doubt, therefore, we're going to be coming back to the firearms issue because of recent horror in gun violence that's been, causing such tragedy in more than one place in the United States. So that's the background to tobacco and guns.
Building on that, Jagdeep, I know that the University of California has likewise divested from tobacco, was an early leader before your time in divesting in part of the South Africa campaign. Can you talk to us about how Sudan, that's right.
Sudan.
Can you talk to us about how, you framed it, I think, quite eloquently about making these financial analyses, and you sold coal. Is it fair to think of coal in the term divestment, or is that asset sale a different decision than, say, Sudan divestment? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, and, management, and I maybe this is not the forum to debate this with you, but I thought management proposed recently that you should reinvest in tobacco, and you were shot down by the board again. So I was curious on what you're...
The board's in charge. It's called
I know they're in
governance.
charge, but you're management, and you said you should invest in tobacco.
No,
so
I think...
so I'm curious about that. That's a public record issue. Anyways, we'll come back to that.
Over a gin and tonic, Jagdeep. That's... The board's in charge.
This is a university. We don't drink here at Berkeley.
The fiduciary body. So you need to understand where decisions
No, I know
are
the
made.
board shot you guys down, but the point is, management proposed that you should reinvest in tobacco. That's the point I'm making. So
And?
I'm curious, why?
Well, that's a separate debate.
Okay, all right. Having said that, I will say that financially, owning tobacco stocks is a positive return. And if that may have been the argument, we could have used the same argument because we report to our boards every year on how much money we've given up as a result of owning tobacco stocks over the time that we made that decision. But again, we are not an isolated, look, one of the things about my community, which is the investor community, is we tend to live in this bubble thinking we are investors, so therefore you shouldn't tell us what to do. Sometimes we live behind the cloak of a fiduciary and that responsibility. We have a view at the University of California, and I have a personal view that's very strong on this, which is we are part of the fabric of the University of California. Therefore, if there are decisions that are made and are values that exist as a university system, those are things that we should understand and embrace and adopt where we can have an impact. Because we're all one system. It's not our money. It's your money. So the decision was made to go out of tobacco. Pre my time, frankly, if you ask me as management or any of my team, we would not go back to our leadership team and say, let's reinvest in tobacco, because we're a smoke-free environment and a smoke-free university, and there's no debate about that. Guns. It doesn't matter to me what kind of guns. The amount of violence that happens in our schools and on our streets and in our communities has got to stop. This is absolutely unacceptable for people to be able to get guns and the way they access guns. And from our perspective, we're out of guns. Now, those views, and I know sometimes we use this debate, and I fully agree with you. That was our board, not management. But you know, our board looks at me. Our board looks at the CIO, and our board looks at the team. And the board is not living this day in and day out. I am, with my team. So the board says to us, what do you think? You're the professionals. You're spending all the time debating this. And if you have a good relationship with your board, ultimately, they do weigh seriously the recommendations that we make. And if I had to make the recommendation on guns, I clearly would not make a recommendation for us to be invested in guns, just like tobacco. Let me extend this to climate change. Our university's president, Janet Napolitano, has set a goal for us to be carbon neutral by 2025. Now, we are not going to get there tomorrow. Every one of you has an iPhone and tweeting or emailing or texting whoever you are. There's a video camera in the room. You all came here on cars. Maybe you fly on Southwest for Thanksgiving. You're not saying that you're going to give up fossil fuels tomorrow. But clearly, you care about the issue. And over time, there's a journey in which we want to become much more carbon neutral, either as an individual or a university or society. And in that context, we have similarly set a goal as an office of the CIO to take our existing energy portfolio, which is more fossil fuel-y, and make it much more renewable, just like you're doing at UC Irvine and being a leader in some of the activities there with electric buses and electric vehicles. So your question around us and tobacco and guns and fossil fuels is one that I will say is rooted in the values of our system. And I'm going to end with sexual harassment. It's a controversial topic, but you know, another thing we invest in is venture capital firms. I'm sure you've read the press. I think it's just the beginning. I think the stories that are coming out of the venture capital industry are frankly disturbing and upsetting. And if you ask me, I've had esteemed faculty members from UC Berkeley, women leaders in science and technology, show up to my office for hours to explain to me, why would you not ask the venture capitalists that you're investing in to have good HR practices? And if they see sexual violence, they cannot tolerate it. I think it's a fair point. So and they only had to say one thing to me to convince me of this argument. They left me with the values of the University of California. And in those values, it clearly states, we will not tolerate sexual harassment or sexual violence on our campuses, in our system. Well, if that's what we believe in, why isn't it from an investment standpoint when we see these types of things happen in the industry, we don't take a firm stand? And we can make a choice. That choice is if the manager says, we're not going to do anything about this, well, we won't invest with you. It's as simple as that. So I think at the end of the day, when you are an investor, you're investing your money, and those monies come from an institution that has certain values, and those values have to be respected. And if you can find a way to connect the values to the investments in a way that still can earn you a decent return for the risks you take, I feel it's a much more mission-driven, gratifying way of investing your money than simply saying, I'm just an investor, don't talk to me, I'm only going to manufacture a return for you.
That's great. Further, I think both Jagdeep and Anne have talked about fiduciary responsibility in part of the discussion about divestment. So Adam, when you were part of this Divest Sudan movement, I think perhaps one of the big achievements of that movement was having a law passed into the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act, which explicitly carved out protections for investors by offering definitions around fiduciary responsibility. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and just a couple, I'll talk about that briefly, a couple of quick points. prior to my current role, and I currently teach in venture finance and come from that world, and couldn't agree more. And I want to point out my friend Del Medina, if you can wave, is doing really cool work and research on equity and inclusion in the venture space. So for those of you around the next couple of days, please chat with her. I also want to maybe defend Anne for a second. In my experience, as an activist engaging with CalPERS, STRS, the University of California, I discovered that the governance of these institutions are incredibly complex. You have the legislature, you have boards, you have management, staff, and as great as it is, and Jagdeep, I wish you were here at the university 10 years ago, because even though eventually the UC embrace the policy that they played a role in developing, if you look at the history of public statements and when we first engaged in the UC on this issue, there was zero interest in engaging and very much hid behind the shield of fiduciary duties. And as someone, I know we're closing comments on that, but as someone who's practiced corporate law and teaches in that space, it's one of the most vague bodies of case law. I mean, I would love to debate both sides of that. So it's incredibly complex, and but having good people like Jagdeep and Anne running these investment institutions is incredibly important. Quickly on the point of the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act. So early on, we focused on the local and state level. So as I mentioned, we wrote, after we adopted this policy for the University of California, we were asked by a state legislator in California to write a bill for the state of California. And that's where we really honed this idea of the targeted divestment model. We then got a large grant to basically work across the country. The next state I went to, I spent then 6 months in Texas. We passed a law there after California. It was a different experience than working in California, but exciting. And then we passed the same law in 26 other states. And there was always this question whether or not the states acting, so it was actually, in almost every state, it was legislatively mandated. So it wasn't independently adopted by any of the state pension funds. It was the state legislature, which I think there is some warrant to, and we could discuss that. That's another issue. But there was this question whether states adopting these policies constituted states acting in foreign affairs. And there's constitutional issues there, whether they were preempting, that's foreign relations is the domain of the federal government, and there was this question whether states were preempting that. We had a pretty elegant argument that they weren't. It was never, our legislation was never challenged, but ultimately the driving force behind this federal law was to basically clear the way. So it was the federal government basically asserting that states were allowed, post-authorizing states to do this. They also adopted the targeted divestment policy in regards to federal contracting. So the same companies that were now exposed to the state divestment were also exposed to prohibition on federal contracts.
Got it. Jagdeep and Anne, I'll throw this up for either of you. Do you feel that greater clarity, greater guidance from public authorities around this concept of fiduciary duty, would it make your jobs more straightforward? Would it make decisions more straightforward within your organizations? Is the jury still out on fiduciary duty as when it comes down to incorporating ESG factors, in your view?
I don't think the jury's out. I think the jury was completely, as I said, I go back to the Crusades, and trust law was invented so that the Crusaders, as they headed off to pillage and slaughter, had assets, wives, servants, animals, not necessarily in that order, probably animals were the most important, could be entrusted to a third party and with duties of prudence, loyalty, and care to look after that stuff until the Crusader came back. And genuinely, that's the origins. This is 11th century. Our law professor, you're nodding, it's true, it really is true. So the question is, what else would you add in at this stage of the game when you're thinking about climate change? It's a risk and it's an opportunity. So if I have a duty of prudence and care to people and their beneficiaries, that means their children, joining the fund now to think about what's climate change going to be doing in the next, well, it's here actually, we don't have to wait. What's happening with the melting of glaciers, what's happening with drought, with wildfires, with water, with agriculture over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. That is clearly, to us, a risk to the system. And if I'm being a prudent fiduciary who is loyal to the beneficiaries, that's not just the people who are retired now, that's the future retirees. So we have intergenerational responsibilities. I would say within that, it would be irresponsible under fiduciary law to ignore climate change. And I'm be happy to, now what's interesting is in the United States, the regulatory body, the Department of Labor, which looks after rules and regulations for private sector pension funds, noticed that the corporate world, the private sector funds, were worrying about whether environmental, social, and governance factors might have an impact on risk and return. Although think about an investment strategy which says this: we're not paying any attention to the environment. Where does your water come? No, none of my business. Pollution? No, not interested in that either. What about your diversity and inclusion? No interest on that either. What kind of investment strategy sounds credible that avoids ESG? It's impossible to think of you being prudent and having loyalty and a duty of care without integrating all of that. So the Department of Labor actually issued a bulletin quite recently to say it was within the fiduciary responsibilities of trustees to take into account environmental, social, and governance factors. Now, I don't know a higher authority, do you? I mean, we have the Constitution of California, but the Department of Labor has actually stepped out of the legal shadows to say, it's okay. Mm-hmm. It really does make a difference. Yes. Sea level rise, your property's underwater, you can't recruit people, you've got harassment suits. These are all relevant to risk and return. And in the short term, anything goes. But over the long term, which is our duty, all of this is relevant.
Jagdeep, this one's for you. California communities have recently sued fossil fuel companies for damages related to sea level rise. This highlights the potential liabilities of fossil fuel company investments. Damages are being based in part on attribution science, showing how much the level of sea level rise. I'm just going to skip forward. Science, facts.
Is that question from the Council of Scientists?
It may be.
I guess.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the question. Here's the punchline. How will investors respond to this attribution science and the documented climate science deception of fossil fuel companies?
Wow, that's loaded. I'm going to answer that in 1 second. First of all, Anne,
yes.
I'm not taking a shot at you, so I want to say something about Anne. I mean, we talk about fiduciary responsibility, we talk about governance, we talk about public institutions. Ultimately, it's about people and individuals who believe and care about these things. And I know you've now been with CalPERS close to a decade, but we all look to you. And we look to you individually more than even your institution, because coming from Europe and the practices that you brought and the principles-based approach and the way you've moved CalPERS in the direction you have, I'm not sure they would have made as much progress, frankly, with the complications of the governance and the whole system. So there are very few examples in the United States. And it takes individuals to be able to move the dialogue. And so whilst Anne has been a beacon and a light and a leader in a California context and an asset for California and a teacher to many of us as we've been looking to learn and move in this direction, I will say on this question of governance systems in public, this is a very difficult time in the world. It's a very difficult time in our country. And I would suggest that instead of relying upon governance systems, we have to continue the grassroots effort. Mm-hmm. And each of you has to continue to push forward for the things you believe in as it might relate to all of these issues. Because sometimes you may feel that your voice is not being heard within the boardrooms or the public institutions or the leadership of the nation. And I think that grassroots effort is what is ultimately going to be that voice that will keep the pressure on our public officials to understand that if they need to get elected again, they cannot simply pull out of accords. They have to pay attention to these Paris Accords and the coalitions and the collaboration that needs to happen. So to the question of climate and fossil fuels and sea level rise, look, here's the way I look at it. Fossil fuel companies have done very well for a very long time. But the reality is, for a whole variety of these risks, whether it's the sea level rise or the emissions or even their safety practices and the spillage and the environmental concerns that come about. Whatever issue you pick, and sea level rise is one example of that. We are proud to be Californians in a way because California in itself is the leader in this country, in many ways in the world, on a lot of these issues and sending these messages out. I think a lot has to be done to continue the pressure on fossil fuel companies. It's no coincidence that Saudi Arabia has woken up to the fact that they believe their own assets in the ground may be worth more 30 years from now than they are today. So it's probably a good idea to share that risk with institutional investors around the world. That's not a tactical move or a strategic move to raise more money. It's a move to recognize that you need to diversify your economy from a risk that is there today and one that clearly you see in the future. Because even the Saudi youth that make up the bulk of the population do not want to be associated with these types of risks for their future. Those are the types of issues that we have to keep putting pressure on fossil fuel companies. And I think the 2-degree world is real. You don't need, just the last 6 months, you can look at the effect of climate change in our own country, whether it's in Florida or in Texas or in Puerto Rico. You pick the example you want. And these issues, in many ways, fossil fuel companies are arguably responsible for certain aspects of this. Now, I'm not advocating tomorrow that we're going to sell our fossil fuel companies, and please don't tweet that the CIO at the University of California suggested that he would be doing this at the end of this afternoon debate. But I do believe these risks are so real that at a grassroots level and with leaders like Anne, we need to keep putting the pressure on our public officials. And if a lawsuit from a legal perspective is another way by which we can do that, do it. Because these types of things will ultimately make a difference when you collect all the voices.
Can I probe on that a little
Yes,
more,
please.
Jagdeep? So you have already made the financial analysis that has supported divesting from coal.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry, you asked me about coal.
Well, sure. I was just going to probe a little bit more on the what is the financial. So presumably then there is a financial analysis, however, that supports continuing to hold other types of fossil fuels, albeit at a much, much lower percentage of your portfolio than, say, broad stock indices. Is that sort of analysis, and this was a question that came up for Anne as well, what sort of analytical work have each of your organizations done that actually support continuing to hold this?
So here's
what's the counter argument?
So to your point about if I was around 7 years ago, you know what? 7 years ago, these were not issues that mattered as much on the agenda of the world. They do today. So it's easy to argue that we should have been here in the past, but I think the reality is if you're a leader today or you're a student, and I'll give you a simple example. Many of you are going to make career choices after your MBA program or your undergrad degree. You probably want to go work for a company that is aligned with your individual values, not one that is against your values of climate, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. These things and this generation that we live in today is very real, and so you're asking the hard questions. In that context, this takes up about 20 to 30% of my personal time around sustainability issues, and I don't think as a leader in an organization today, you can ignore these issues. So that's point number one. Point number two, it is great to make the arguments theoretically from a moral and a social standpoint and a headline-grabbing perspective. And we had the same issues on coal. The reality is, the science to these arguments on how you get out of coal is if you have a coal plant and there's carbon dioxide emissions, and if you simply put a price to carbon dioxide, not just today, but any time over the next 20 years in which you think you might own the coal plant, it's very hard to come back mathematically to a net present value that looks like you're actually going to make money on the investment, because the carbon tax and the risk, the potential risk of a legislation that might add a carbon tax to the economic price of a coal asset is enough to deter you from making an investment in a coal asset. If you extend that to fossil fuels, here's how I think about it. The whole world today, 14 to 15% of global gross domestic product, GDP, is energy or energy-related services. 14 to 15%. About 5 to 6 billion of it is energy-producing company, trillion, I'm sorry. And the rest of it, another 5 or so, is 5 to 6 is the energy-related services. If you take that as the picture of the planet Earth, or all the corporations from the Victorian era that you're describing, and you bring it right back to the University of California office of the CIO, we manage 115 billion. 10 to 15% of our portfolio, one way or the other, is energy or energy-related services. So if you asked me for moral reasons to sell our fossil fuel holdings, essentially the instructions you're giving us is to go ahead and divest or sell 10 to 15 billion dollars of our assets. Will that make an impact? Will that impact the performance of our portfolio? Yes. Can we do that instantaneously? No, because we have obligations to our pensioners and to our students. So in that context, when you look at the math around the analysis, you have to be prudent as you think about how you get out of such a large base of investments. And I think over time, when a commodity goes from $100 to $30, and the value of your asset reduces by 70%, when the prices go back up, you start to sell them slowly because you don't want to take a loss on these investments. But you need to replace them with something because you can't sit in cash. Guess what? The price for solar and wind is even cheaper now than it ever has been, and it's very competitive, and it's at grid parity. So in that context, you have good opportunities to put your money to work in alternative renewable energies. And the beginning of electric vehicles and the electrification of our society is going to be another set of opportunities. So that's why I think you don't need to be too analytical. You can be pretty high level. And when you actually do the math for either N or I, it's not a trivial number.
No.
And in that context, you have to be prudent over the long term, and you can do it piecemeal. But this is a journey. None of you are going to give up your iPhones today. Trust me. You're too addicted to Twitter. As a result, there are fossil fuels involved in how your iPhones came to the world. Until we have a new iPhone that is touchscreen in the air, you may not be giving up your fossil fuel addiction as well.
So Anne, that same question from the audience, and asking specifically about CalPERS being a public institution, is any analysis that CalPERS has done about the risk-adjusted returns projections for fossil fuels, is that in the public record, and has it been peer-reviewed, is the audience question.
Has it been peer-reviewed? So I'm going to let Jagdeep look at our data because he's our peer. This is where we've got to. So before the Paris Agreement, is everyone familiar with the Paris Accord? So all the world got together and said something must be done finally on climate change, and it is integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a plan, bottom up, each country said what they would and could do. And all of that, I think, takes us from 4 degrees to 3. With the US pulling out, it might be a bit more, but the We're Still In movement is powerful, and CalPERS is a signed-up member of the We're Still In. I guess the UC is probably as well, Jagdeep. Yes, thumbs up. So this message that Jagdeep is giving about the power of the financial markets, which are owned by pension funds like ours, and citizens and NGOs, do not underestimate how that can actually drive change. That's important. The data point, this is what we've done. We thought when we were going to Paris to speak to the governments of the world in Paris about what we wanted out of the deal. You know, we wanted a strong commitment. We actually wanted things like carbon pricing, but we didn't get them. But anyway, we'll keep going on that one. We also realized that, well, okay, well, what are the financial markets going to do? What are we going to be doing as investors? So what we signed up for was something called the Montreal Pledge, thinking about Canada and your Alberta and so forth. The Montreal Pledge basically said that investors would assess their carbon footprint. And this is no small piece of work for us. So this $340+ billion asset class is about half of it in 11,000 public companies in 47 markets worldwide. Start there. We also have fixed income, there's government debt, corporate securities. So we've done it for the first half of the fund. We've done it for global fixed income. The next will be all of our property assets, and then private equity will be last, because it's going to be the most difficult. We're in the midst of a big restructuring of our private equity portfolio, as some of you might know. So what did we find out from that? We found that of these 11,000 companies, less than 100 of them were responsible for more than half of the emissions that we were invested in. And then a good idea. Well, if CalPERS is invested in these 100 companies, probably our sister funds around the world are holding a piece of these funds, of these companies as well. And if we decided to come together and drive change with the same focus, we could actually ensure that these companies develop their strategies in line with the Paris Agreement. And that is a project called the Climate Action 100+. We're busy signing up funds to join with us. We're up to about 5 trillion as of this morning. And we're going to launch the list of companies at the Paris second anniversary climate summit on the 12th of December. So go and look at the website and see what we're doing. I think what we have to understand is the power of money. You know, money talks, but money can talk on this issue just as much as money talks on anything else. And the data underneath this is really important to us. Another project that we have is actually mapping physical climate risk onto our portfolio. This is something under our 5-year strategic plan. We're looking at how water risk and also extreme temperature rise is going to affect 2 of our asset classes. Real assets, so we own buildings, housing, apartment blocks, and depending on where they are, we're going to be hit by climate risk. I mean, whether it's extreme weather events, sea level rise, or think about what's happening in certain parts of the world. As temperature rises beyond what's naturally possible for human beings, that's going to affect all the economic activity. And there's a whole swathe of areas, populated areas, from India to Louisiana and further, being affected already by extreme temperature.
So Anne, is any of this analysis in the public domain? Does CalPERS make this analysis available perhaps to other investors who might find it actionable?
We've shared all the carbon footprint. CalPERS meets every month in public. You're all welcome to come. So all of our data and analysis goes into the public domain.
Great.
The idea of the Climate Action 100 is that we can share the analysis around all of this, you know, what we're calling systemically important carbon emitters. Whether we hold these shares or we sell them, these are the companies whose emissions need to come down. Otherwise, we're going to be exposed to climate risk anyway. As we build out the climate risk data mapping project, which has just begun, again, we're a public institution. I would say pretty much everything other than personnel and commercially sensitive investment decisions like hiring and firing managers is in the public domain.
Great.
So
Jagdeep,
we'd love you to look at it, and we'd love your feedback.
I'd just say it's very early days.
Yeah.
We're all signing people up to try and do better measurements, but honestly, I mean, the science around the measurement is very tough. Yep. And the good news is, you know, we have incredible climate scientists here at the UC, even the law faculty, the law department, the business school, student projects. Lots of people are doing things. There are new standards being set up. I think at the end of the day, what we all want to do is we want to get companies to, just like they disclose the assets they have and the liabilities they have,
Right.
and the risks that they have in their organization, to disclose the carbon and climate and other types of risks. And I think those are the types of things, if you can ultimately, and I think Anne is right, if you can go right back to the individual actor who is the company and get them to disclose more, that's the best measurement. And then we're all trying to collate. And so I think a lot of the effort right now is on pressure that's being put to the corporation to get them to act better. If you can do that by having them measure things and disclose, and I think that's where it's very helpful for academic institutions to define frameworks and standards, and that's the role institutions like the UC and others can play in this regard. But it's very early days, and hopefully that should not be a deterrent. More than money, I think what talks is conversations and collaboration around this area, and that's the most hopeful thing in terms of a systemic change that we're going to see.
Great. So we have great questions here. I'm trying to synthesize a number of them. And a number of them talk about the pace toward divestment of fossil fuels. But I'll take a detour with that context in mind to give Adam a question on, is there rigorous peer-reviewed, I like being in an academic institution where people like peer review, evidence that divestment by institutional investors has resulted in corporate behavior change? If so, citations would be great. Was that something that you folks looked at when you were working with the Sudan Divestment Network?
It was tough. I mean, I had the privilege of being involved in a documentary around this issue, and it was an interview and a quote I said, and this is true, we envisioned ourselves as student activists, and we would push this campaign to a certain point, and that the experts, whoever they were, divestment experts, fiduciary experts, would take it over once we had raised the profile of it to a certain point. But then we quickly found out that there were no experts looking at it. And one example of that is the University of California. So one of our first questions, once this was kind of adopted by the UC and your office, was, well, we have to know who these companies are. So the university paid a fair amount from a third party to get a list of companies operating in Sudan. And we expected a very kind of rich piece of research, and all we got was a Excel spreadsheet with just a list of 200 companies with a check mark whether they had connection to Sudan, and no further context, which made engagement almost impossible, right? You could maybe construct a poor screen out of that list. So that's when we realized we actually had to do research on these companies and then engage with these companies just to find out a bit more what was going on. So for the next 6 years of this organization's life that I ran, I'd say over half of our resources were dedicated towards conducting research on these companies. We joked, we had an employee that we named Beth. She was our most expensive employee, and she was actually a Bloomberg terminal. That we bought and learned how to use Bloomberg, and it was the most, that cost more than any of our salaries at the time. So it was just I think Jagdeep's right. I mean, we're still just kind of the lack of research. There's been some case studies around specific companies. We have evidence of companies adopting our policies, but yeah, the lack of peer-reviewed, I think, research is, and I have questions about the efficacy of divestment, but ultimately I think, like I said, it's a tool to make engagement most effective at its best, and it's complicated. I mean, people argue that you sell into a public market, there's always usually another buyer, but finance is far more complicated than like that. There's new financing vehicles that companies are looking to all the time. And anyway, so it's complicated, but there definitely needs to be more work done on that.
And I think Jagdeep, actually, on the UC, on your office's website, you have some peer-reviewed paper citations on this topic.
I think so. I mean, the wonderful thing is, if you talk about divestment around fossil fuels and a transition timeline, right? As an example, if that was the question, I think there's clearly a lot of academic research, even out of our own institution and around the world, that talks about climate change or evolution of sort of what the risks might be. Where I had a challenge from an investment standpoint was to answer the question saying, if I owned X dollars of fossil fuel today and I wanted to move to a much more sustainable energy portfolio, how long should I take to do that? And what's the process I should employ? So actually working with a professor out of UC Davis, Amy Jaffe, who's now the Consul on Foreign Relations, and I'll just do a little plug, and we're happy to email it to all of you. We took about 1.5 years together to write this paper on the new energy transition, especially from an investor's lens, for my own peers, so that we can understand the process that we want to employ. And in terms of peer review, I think it is going to get published by the Journal of Investing shortly. So hopefully, I mean, that's a peer-reviewed process by which it's gone through. So that's an example. I think there's lesser information that answers the very pointed questions in terms of the investment process. But in terms of the general area, there's a ton of it. The danger, I would say, is a lot of we had a great conversation with some students not too long ago, and we explained to them how they might want to read the paper, and they said they didn't have time. But they do have time to go through a 140-word tweet. And I think we live in this world.
You're way behind at Snapchat.
No, hang on.
Right?
Snapchat.
Yes, come on. Who's on Snapchat?
This is a censored conversation, I hope. But the point I want to make is that you know, there's so many tweets out there, and there's so much fake news, and there's so much sort of half-a-page article that you shouldn't, and there's a lot of people that use that as the basis of research.
It's not so black and white.
To frame an argument, and I think that's where you have to be very careful when you're making real decisions that impact billions of dollars, is you're careful about taking the time, and I think that's the beauty of an academic institution. So my call to action to the business school and to the law school and to the university faculty is spend the time collaborating with investors to do some of this research and get it out there.
Right.
So it's more substantive and instructive on what we can do.
But I think they are. I mean, I think the students that run these campaigns are incredibly savvy. I mean, you admitted that 3 years ago, I mean, they were when the price of oil was 100. I mean, now you're saying you agree, but it's a timing issue, right?
Neither the students nor I could have forecasted the price would go down to 30.
Fair,
but anyway.
What if it goes down further? I mean, aren't you saying that you can be moral to a point, right? But then I guess, what if it was private prisons you were in and you waited?
See, this is fun. Now we're getting into a debate. You're absolutely right. The students are savvy, but I will tell you, I can't forecast the price of oil. Probably neither can the King of Saudi Arabia. I think the reality is we can make a judgment on what might happen, and I'm confident the students either can't forecast it, because if we could, they should be in a different profession right away. I think the reality is we have to judge the risks. And in that context, the decisions are it's not your decision or a student's decision or my decision.
Yeah.
It's the decision of a community.
Yeah.
And in that context, the engagement, the collaboration, and then and whilst you want to make a sound decision, remember, you have a pension that we have an obligation to. The last thing I want you to accuse us of is that we were basically flippant about making a decision on selling something that would have made you money.
Yeah.
That's where I think the academic community and the peer review system can come up with some better research that can give us the insight. So I'm making the same point I think you are, but I think you have a role to play to help us make that point more firmly.
Yeah.
And I do have a citation.
Disagree,
Sorry.
because...
Really?
May I?
Please.
Ever so nicely. We started out thinking we need evidence, and we need to gather it all in, and we actually had a project called the Sustainable Investment Research Initiative. Siri, yes, just before Siri came out. Yeah, and Apple hasn't sued us, so we're friends, you know, it's all good in California. So we first of all gathered in, with the help of a panel of academics, including from Berkeley, 800 papers. We've just refreshed that, and we're now up to over 2,000 papers. The point is, nobody makes an investment decision based on academic papers. What you need is an integrated investment process. So I would just say that the practical side of this is the bit where I think the work needs to be done. And what we're finding is that all of the due diligence, the contracting, the performance monitoring needs to have environmental, social, and governance factors woven in at every single stage of the decision making. So if you want to look at this week's board, you can see our real assets team reporting on their underwriting matrix, reporting on the energy optimization strategy in the buildings and the homes and so forth that we're involved with. You can hear about our emerging manager program, where we've got 10 billion allocated to women and minority-owned financial investors, because we believe inclusion is actually going to give us access to ideas, opportunity, fresh thinking that you don't get through. When you're as big as we are, you know, anyone will talk to CalPERS, I assure you. We're so big. It's not because we're interesting. It's actually just size will get people's attention. So we have that program in order to get money out into new places. But I think what we're finding, because we're so big and complicated, is actually making sure that every stage of the decision process, you have to go through a disciplined assessment, not just of the risk, but also of the opportunities. And what we're finding, even from the energy optimization strategy that we've got in place, is basically making sure when new money is asked for buildings, that it's doing retrofits, which actually upgrade buildings. We're actually finding that that is not only saving us money, it's making us money. It's actually making money for the fund. And it's that kind of example that I think we need more of, because the data are not there. Companies do not report sufficiently on these issues for us to have robust conclusions. So we'll work on that. Jagdeep and me, we'll be working on that with accounting standards, and all things need to happen. But in the meantime, I think we have to hold investors' feet to the fire to ask, What did you ask on diversity and inclusion? How do you measure that? What are you doing on climate risk? What are you doing on community relations? And get it factored into the investment decisions.
Great, thank you. We're getting the hook. I want to ask Adam to give his one. I think we've heard bits of calls to action from both Jagdeep and Anne. Adam, what would be your call to action to everybody who's here in the audience today looking for an opportunity to really make positive change through investing?
Yeah, I think I'd speak to the students. I mean, just keep pushing. I think there are great people at all of these institutions, and it's just connecting with them and holding their feet to the fire, which I think makes it easier for them to take these actions. So it's just my takeaway looking back at the campaign that I started was just the system was so much more connected than I thought it would be, and so I think that would be my takeaway.
I hate to be the hook. This is such a rich discussion, but I want to could everyone give a round of applause just for today?